The next node we're going to look at is the Splatter node. And if we start to type Splatter in our library, we will see that there are 4 different Splatter nodes. They are actually grayscale and color versions of 2 different kinds of Splatter nodes. One is the regular Splatter node, which randomizes all over. And then the Splatter circular, basically the same idea, only it's geared towards making circular patterns. And the great thing about the Splatter node is that of all of the things that we've looked at so far, it's the one that gives us the greatest amount of leeway as far as randomization of individual objects goes. And that means that we can worry less about tiling when we use a Splatter node than we do about the Transform 2D or the pixel processor. The reason for this is that the Splatter node is driven by an effects map, and therefore it has a lot of the they've actually exposed a lot of the things that you can do in an effects map, and they've exposed those parameters in here, and you can find those by going to Edit Effects Map if you want to reverse engineer. And short of actually making your own effects map, the Splatter node is probably the best node to use if you want that kind of effect. Before we actually start working with it, I'd like to briefly go through the various instance parameters that we have here. But in order to do that, let's first link up the images that we're actually going to use. I'm right-clicking on my package, and I'm going to link some bitmaps. And we're going to link these 4 card suit bitmaps, and this will drop them down into our resources folder. And we can go ahead and drag them in, and then change their output modes to grayscale. Now here is one of the limitations of the Splatter node. You'll notice that it's only going to take 1 input. Therefore, we're limited in how many objects we can actually randomize at once. In an effects map, once we learn how to do effects maps, we won't have that limitation. So for this one, as an exercise, we're also going to create a switch. We can come into our library and start typing Multiswitch, and we now have the option of either a color or a grayscale multi-switch, and we'll go with the grayscale. And we can start hooking up our inputs. Now, you'll notice it's not automatically giving me more inputs, and that's because I'm going to set them in here. We have 2 options. We can have an input number, so we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 as our input number. And input selection is going to switch between which input is actually going to be pushed out of the node. And as we go up, we're scrolling through those inputs. Oops, it's only going up to 4. So when it comes time to expose this, we can actually set a clamp so that the number won't be able to go over 4. But all we have to do is create an input parameter that will correspond to these integers. Let's go ahead and do that. We can double-click on our graph and create a new input parameter, and we'll call this card suit. And we'll leave the group alone for now. Let's add a D in there. Our default we'll leave as 1. Oh, but we actually have to change this to an integer 1. And then we're going to change this to a drop-down list. And we will add, yeah, we can keep it at 0. So let's add our card suits. We have clubs. We have our diamond, heart, and spade. So we now have, corresponding to 0 through 3, we have club, diamond, heart, spade. However, it's going to be looking for the number 1 here, because if we come back to this selection here is the number 1. So there's no 0 here. So we have to go back to our input parameters, and we have to change the defaults. I'm going to put in the number 1 here, and you'll notice I'm getting a warning sign because these do have to be unique values. But that's okay, because as I go down the line, it's just going to not be happy until I give everything a unique number. Now it's going to correspond correctly. And we can just take this and plug it into our Splatter node. And now we can begin to apply whatever dynamic functions we put in here to the thing that has been chosen by our switch. Before we go adding any more variables to start working on our splatter, let's just take a look at what this does without any fancy animations, and let's just run through what it can do. You can set the width. Let's make sure that's in our window. You can set the width and the height separately here, which makes it easier to sort of do weird things to your image. The rotation of each individual little bit now can be manipulated through here. So you can see how this is already different from, for example, the pixel processor. This rotation variation sort of changes the variety of the starting point of the rotation, so they're not all the same now. You're actually setting some variety in their starting points. Zoom just does that, but it's going to break tiling for you. This is not something that you want to use if you're concerned about your edges. Gain, this is, well, it's not going to get much more gainy than what we have. Well, I guess you can a little bit. This can pan X and Y. So you can use the splatter node to pan as well. Disorder is just going to shift randomly the starting points of your various little iterations. And the grid number is going to determine your tiling. So if you do want to keep things tiled and you want to make things bigger and smaller, use grid number, because that will tile. Disorder angle further randomizes that disorder. Now you'll notice it's still very grid-like, and that's because disorder random has been set to false. So they're currently only disordering within their own little grid parameters. But if you set this to false, you start to get some real randomization. Pattern size, honestly, I don't know, and I researched in their documentation, and all they say for pattern size is a range of numbers. So that's not very helpful. It doesn't seem to do anything. Size variation, however, does, and this is actually pretty cool because you can set the variety of the sizes within your randomization. And this is about your level of detail scaling, and then you have some levels in here also, and you can change your background color, etc. This is a really cool node. it can be a little expensive computationally, and that actually kind of brings up the subject of optimization. We're not going to really be talking about that here, but just as a general rule, be aware of the fact that the more variables you have in an animation, the more work computationally the material has to do. If you find your animations are kind of sluggish, try getting rid of some of the variables. The other thing to keep in mind is the way that Substance calculates variables. It pays to put all the heavy lifting as far as your animations or computations go as close to the end result as you can. Sometimes it's not possible. We're not really worrying about it here because this is a really lightweight material and it won't really apply. But again, the way that it works is that every time it hits a variable, it has to recalculate everything. So if you have most of your calculations happening behind where the variable is, they only have to get calculated once. If you have them out in front, they have to get calculated pretty much every time your variable gets calculated, and that can lag your material down considerably. So those are some general rules as far as building materials, but like I said, it's not something we're really going to worry about here. But if you do run into problems, those are two very basic things that you should keep in mind. So let's figure out what input parameters we want to make for our splatter node. I would like to have my pattern size change, but I want to keep it in proportion. So we'll make a variable that we're going to actually apply to both of these at the same time. The other thing I would like to animate is the rotation, because that would be pretty cool. So we'll need a rotation variable. And finally, I'd like to be able to pan it. I'm not going to worry about creating variables to have the end user change this pan, but I just want my thing to slowly pan across. But I'd like to be able to control the speed of just that pan rather than its direction. So I'm going to set it in, and then we're just going to control the speed with which that happens. And I think that that's probably the only inputs that we're going to use, because all of this stuff we're going to set in ahead of time, and we're not going to make variables for them. So let's double click on our graph, and we'll come into our input parameters, and we'll create some new ones. Let's create our pan speed. And I'm going to leave this as a float one, I think. I'm just going to pan it along the X. I don't really want it to do much more than that. And we'll call it pan speed. And let's make a group for this. We'll call this group cards. And I'm going to copy that and then paste it into here. And the default for our pan speed we can leave at 0.3, 0.4. And we'll make the minimum 0 and the minimum, actually let's make the minimum -1 so we can change the direction as well. And while we're at it, let's come up here. I'm not sure we ever changed that in here. Let's take a look at that. I know I thought about it. No, we didn't. Let's make our minimum here -1 as well. And this will allow for panning in both directions. Yeah. Okay. So we've got pan speed set in. And we also wanted to make a variable for our pattern rotation. We'll call this pattern rotation. And We can just call it rotation here because we've already got a group. And this is going to be about the speed. So we're going to be using the same timer. Let's make the maximum 2. I can't imagine that would be anything more than that. And we'll make the the default 0. And finally, we are going to create our pattern size. And here again, we're going to leave it as a float 1. And we'll call this size. And the group is cards. The default we'll have as 1. And we'll make the maximum, I don't know, let's make it 10. And that should be that. Now we can come into our splatter node and start to apply. I'm just gonna close these out for a second, and we're gonna start to apply them to what we have in here. Let's come in here, make an empty function, and then click on our icon to get into that window. You'll notice the way they have the pattern size set up here is it's going from, I guess, 1 to 1,000. I'm not sure yeah, 1 to 1,000. And I want my slider to go from 1 to 10. So we'll get our variable for our pattern size. And rather than just having this set as our output node, what we'll do is we'll add a multiplication node and get a constant and set that to 100. And if we multiply the two of these together, then that will give us a result that's actually going to fit with what they want in this splatter node. To make my life simpler, I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to Control-C to copy it. I'm going to come in here, empty function, click on that, and just go ahead and paste that in here and set that as my output node. So that's our first parameter done. The next one we want to work on is our rotation. Have these little guys spinning around. Now the rotation variation, I'm going to set all the way up to 360 degrees. So I'm going to let it randomly select a number between 1 and 360 that's going to be the starting point of that rotation. And all we have to do then is create a function in here. Again, we just click on that, and that brings us to the empty graph. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get our variables in here. So I'm going to duplicate that one, and we have our $time function, and then we have the number that we're setting for our pattern rotation. And just like before, we're going to want to multiply these two guys together. Now, I happen to know, just because I've worked with this node before, the timers, it's going to be much slower than we had it set before. So I'm going to add an extra multiplication node in here with a constant float. I'm going to multiply this by 100. I haven't really taken the time to figure out why the time differentials are so different, but it doesn't really matter because you can just adjust for it this easily. That should be our rotation speed for our various little images there to work. And if we come back to our splatter node, the next thing that we want to work on is this pan X. Again, we can make an empty function. We can get into our function and start bringing in variables again. We are going to want this to pan, so I'm going to duplicate it. One of these we'll set as our timer. The other one we'll set to that pan speed. And again, we're only going to be panning on the X, so this is going to be a very simple function. And we're going to do the same thing that we did with the other one and multiply this by 100. We can come back in and change this later, but if we leave these numbers low like this, it'll actually look like it's not moving at all. That's that done. And then there's one more thing that I want to work on in this splatter node, which we really haven't made a variable for. And that's this disorder. I want them to kind of float around just on their own. And for now, let's see how it works with time, whether we need to speed it up at all, but I'm just going to stick time in there. And that'll be the extent of what we've done with that. Let's see what this looks like when we publish it out. Oh, we still have to hook this stuff up. To make things simpler, why don't we just put this in here and get rid of these guys temporarily, and we'll just go ahead and publish that like that. In here, we're just going to refresh our image. And we haven't brought in any of those other variables, so they're not appearing for us because we got rid of those nodes temporarily. So pan speed, let's check that out. So I think that's working pretty good. We could probably slow it down, but you know, at this point it's a matter of aesthetics. The rotation, let's get this to 0 so we can look at them separately. The rotation is working. That is it set up to 2, so this is 100 roughly here. I'm pretty happy with the constant that I put in there. But again, if you want it to go slower, you just lower that number down. And the size works as well. So this is working out for us, and I'm going to go back to substance, and I'm just going to do Control Z to get back to our original material. And then in the next video, we're going to look into how we're going to hook this up to what we've made up here.